Well, we spent a lot of years trying to hold this thing together, and in my opinion, the whole system broke in 2007 and 8. The subprime mortgages, and I was saying before that, gosh, we got the entire U.S. economy depending on the housing bubble and the mortgage finance bubble, and when that breaks, the system's going to break. Well, it broke with Lehman. That was a kill job. That was a rescue of Goldman Sachs with no reference to that. But in the following couple of years, it continued to break, and what did we do? We went to 0%, made it pretty clear it's forever. What else did we do? We went to bond monetization, the QE. I love QE. It makes it sound like it's like CPR. No, it's death. It's hyper-monetary inflation, what Nazi Germany did in the 1930s. It wrecked everything. No, so we got this ZIRP, zero interest rate policy, and QE. It's all very sophisticated stuff. These are desperation measures to hold it together because the system's broken. And now we're getting to the point where QE and all the bond purchases is causing some major problems, and it's breaking the entire economic structures, while at the same time clowns like Prince Draghi in the European Central Bank, he's having his patch jobs declared as illegal. So, it's all breaking, Greg. It's all breaking, and they're having a tremendous problem holding it together, and now the whole Eastern world is rebelling against the dollar.
Well, let's talk about what happened in Ukraine, because you sent me some of your notes on what was going on, and you're talking about this Iran, which I brought up in my weekly news wrap-up, the Iran-Russia deal for $20 billion, and why would the world's largest oil producer, Russia, be wanting some of trading more oil, getting more oil? And I think it's to basically flood the world or put more oil out there in non-dollar terms. But you're saying that this deal between Iran and Russia would have never happened had it not been for the U.S. forcing this Crimean incident, the Ukrainian incident during the Olympics, and there was a coup, and we were funding that coup in Ukraine. But you're saying that this deal, $20 billion in trade, 500,000 barrels of oil a day in this deal for $20 billion is what the deal is between Russia and Iran, would have never happened had it not been for the push to destabilize Russia and Ukraine and the Crimean Peninsula.
It's just like stage 2 of the sanction backfire. The first one was the 2012 Iran sanctions, and what did that accomplish? Well, they worked with Turkey and India to create the workaround, which is the prototype, as I call it, for gold trade settlement. So India buys Iranian oil and uses Turkey as an intermediary to grab some gold and pay Iran with it. I mean, this is so basic. No, we would never have gotten the Russian deal with Iran, but this is really, you hit it correctly, I think. There's a second side. You said to flood the world with oil that's not paid for in dollars. Exactly, and to establish a pattern so that other countries can see, go ahead, make deals, buy oil, don't use the dollar. It's like, here's a boycott and a defiant step. Follow our lead. It's a model being created. So, it's 500,000 barrels a day. And since when does Russia need their oil? This is a giant favor to Iran. They're going to, this could be, something a little bit different. It could be Iran basically saying, we really want a lot more of your missiles. We want some of your nuclear refinements, centrifuge technology. And what do we have to offer but oil and gas? And, you're just up to your ears in gas, so how about a little bit of oil? So they go ahead and do it. Can you imagine the Saudi Arabians importing oil? That's like New York City and Manhattan importing arrogance. No, they already have plenty of it. Now, this is a backfire against the Russian sanctions. And notice in the press that there are denials that any Russian missiles are involved. No, the Russians have the Sunburn and the Onyx missile, which is a generation, not a year or two, a generation ahead of the Tomahawk cruise missile. They've also got a lot of savvy with nuclear plants, and I'm not talking about, building nuclear bombs. I'm talking about building nuclear plants like Chernobyl, which Langley interfered with and jammed with hacking procedures and forced a meltdown. Chernobyl was caused by Langley.
Wow, that's a big claim.
Oh gosh, that's old news. That's very old stuff. I have about 3 or 4 contacts talking about that like it's pretty damned obvious. And they didn't need that at Fukushima. They just went straight to using a HARP weapon and causing an earthquake. But there's no possible swift blockade with the banks for Russia. Here's just an unbelievably far-fetched, silly concept. Let me just ask you, have you ever known a 400-pound man? Can you wrestle him to the ground? No. With Russia, you've got 12 time zones. Can you wrestle it to the ground and isolate it? No. And when you got handshakes with China, you get the 2 other big superpowers shaking hands, walking side by side, making head nods, agreeing on policy, and pretty soon I think we're going to see Russia saying, you want to pay in yuan for our oil and gas? Fine. Let's just get away from this dollar because it's got so many problems.
Well,
it's got a central bank that's printing money and also giving it to their own banker friends. Let's all avoid the dollar. What do you say we rally around the Chinese yuan? I think that's coming from Putin.
And what about this double eagle, the Russians' version of their SWIFT system, which is something to facilitate global trade? And you say this system, this double eagle system that will counter the SWIFT system, is going to debut sooner than people think.
There are going to be a number of things that happen sooner than we think. Already, okay, here's a funny sequence that happened. The U.S. government announced that they were going to do sanctions against several big Russian banks. So Wall Street stepped in and said, wait a minute, you can't do that. We're screwing with their ruble. We need to go in and hack through a couple of their banks. We need them. Why don't you just pick on one? So they decided on Russia Bank. Russia has major offices in Moscow and St. Petersburg. So Russia Bank comes back and says, all right, you're going to play games with us? We're going to go to exclusive ruble usage. We're not going to do any settlement in dollars or euros. All our transactions with European clients will be done in rubles, and they will have to scurry around to find the rubles. Well, guess what happens when all these European clients have to get rubles to pay for Russian gas and oil?
The ruble strengthens.
The ruble strengthens, and it crushes the London and New York bankers that are interfering with financial warfare on the ruble. Now, what we got is a Eurasian axis that's starting to form. It's going to be Russia, China, and India, and later I think Germany's going to play a key role. Iran and Saudi Arabia are going to play a very strange but important role. They're going to end their conflict, but the real pièce de résistance here regarding the Russian Double Eagle project is they're going to be flooding their banks with gold reserves, gold bars, gold coins. And they're going to be relying on a region called Magadan, which is on the Pacific coast of Russia, 12 time zones away from Poland. Let's try to surround this country. Yeah, from the Atlantic to the Pacific. Let's surround this country. They've got a gold project called Natalka. And Natalka is going to supply what they say, a promise of endless supply of gold to the Russian central bank. Now, you've got the Russians that are selling energy, oil and gas. They've got vodka. They've got technology. They are a leading nation in telecommunications. The KGB is no slouch. They can give NSA a run for their money. And notice that the Russians were doing quite a creditable job in Kiev, intercepting some phone communications to let it be known that the Americans were involved on the rooftop sniper killing police.
Also with Victoria Nuland saying, F the EU. And,
Yeah.
And Newland out public statements saying that they gave, in the last several years, they gave $5 billion to Ukraine. Why? I mean, what are we doing that for? I mean, we're expediting this dollar, this non-dollar trade, are we not? I mean, a lot of people say, and I just want to bring this up because a lot of people say, oh, well, you know, I hear these pundits talking about, oh, it'll be 10, 20 years before the world can do without the dollar. And I say, I don't know. It doesn't look like that the rest of the world is going to allow us to print another, you know, 20 trillion, $30 trillion before they step in and say, okay, we're taking the punch bowl away. I mean, we're done. We're leaving the party. What do you say? Is this going to take 10 or 20 years before that the world, you know, sheds the dollar in global trade?
I think we've gone 10 years longer than its ordinary lifetime should have been, and now we're on the death throes. To people like that, I would say, are you aware that J.P. Morgan sold its headquarters to China? Are you aware that Morgan Stanley sold their Platts energy office desk, trading desk, to Rosneft of Russia? Where have you been? You're not even noticing the tectonic shifts that are going to result in some profound effects. Have you noticed that Iran has worked with Turkey and India to get a workaround of the sanctions that have been a complete failure? Where have you people been? Now, what's coming next is a bold display at the Moscow Bank headquarters of Rossiya Bank. It's going to be a big gold R because they're coming up with a gold-backed ruble. They're tired of this crap. And if the U.S. wants to push them and poke sticks in the Russian bear's face, the Russians are going to turn around and say, all right, we hear you. We only accept rubles. We understand. You want to isolate us? Fine. We'll remain isolated and not use the dollar. But the backfire is the Eastern Hemisphere has a critical mass, and this is something you just don't hear in the Western press. Critical mass means cannot be isolated because it might even be the majority of global trade. How do you isolate the majority of global trade and tell them, we're not going to let you do SWIFT-based dollar transfers? Okay, oh, fine. Fine. They're going to come up with Project Double Eagle, not evil, and challenge the SWIFT. This is not going to be easy for Russia. They are not sophisticated in banking operations and functions. This is like a Anglo-American, French and German monopoly for a century. This goes way back. The U.S. and the British are experts at finance, but they're also experts at corruption in finance, like with bank derivatives and with Forex rigged markets and LIBOR rigged markets. So, you know, the ITAR TASS, which is like their UPI, has come out and trumpeted the news of the golden ruble and its launch. It's not going to be a couple of years away. It's going to be a few months away.
Oh.
And there's another bank, a big bank. They don't have 30 big banks like the U.S. They have 5 or 7. There's another big bank called VTB, and they're well along in ruble usage. And, you know, this is going to be like 3 big Russian banks that work together to do full convertibility of the ruble, which is not new. They've had convertibility. It's going to be fuller convertibility. And at the same time, don't look too hard, but the Chinese are going to be doing the same thing. You know, back to the Double Eagle again, Project Double Eagle. They're going to demand gold payments for oil and gas exports to the West. Now, this is a direct response to an action, very dumb action, desperate action by J.P. Morgan to block bank transactions with Russian embassies. And in one particular instance, it's the Sogaz Insurance Group and in Kazakhstan. So that's where the U.S. decided to take a shot. And the response is going to be rather universal. And notice that the Russians have not yet said, we're going to reduce your natural gas supply through the pipelines of Ukraine, and we're going to reduce it to German, French, and Italian markets. They haven't done that.
Because they're not playing along. Germans are like, no, we don't want sanctions. French, no.
Well, I agree.
Even the UK has a gas deal. They're like they were first to come out and go, no sanctions.
Well, there's a common theme for the two big countries that have said, no, we're not going to climb on board your sanctions wagon. And that's Germany and London. Britain, England. I like calling it London because, that's where all the power is. That's where a lot of the population is. But the Londoners said, we don't want to jeopardize the Chinese yuan bond trade. So if we start hassling and angering the Russians, we might lose the Chinese client. Well, that just proves to you that the Russians and Chinese are arm in arm. And furthermore, Frankfurt, this was apart from the Euro Central Bank. The Frankfurt-based Bundesbank said, we want to proceed with the swap facility and make it so that three of our big banks will work closely with three of China's big banks and not settle trade in the dollar.
Oh,
they don't want to anger Russia. They don't want to piss off China either. So soon I expect we're going to see all the BRICS nations, that's Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, I think they're all going to say, we don't want to get United States real angry, so we're going to play along. And if they want to isolate Russia, we'll join them in isolation. There's your critical mass.
Yeah, we'll join them not using the dollar.
Exactly. We'll just settle in yuan. Thanks for pointing out. I didn't finish my own point. There's a third bank, Sberbank, S-B-E-R Bank, and it's kind of the same route as Siberia. The Sberbank announced that they're going to discontinue all foreign currency-based loans in their European branches. Can you say Russian ruble? This is, they're going to make car loans in, Prague. They're going to be rubles. And when you've got these two gold-backed currencies in the ruble and yuan, oh man, all you got to do is just count months before the dollar is dead, and it's not going to die. I've been, I'm a bit dramatic myself. The dollar's not going to die. The dollar is going to undergo a transformation. It cannot continue in its present state. What it's going to do is it's going to split. All the international dollars are going to be subject to, leave us the hell alone. They're not going to have the dollar bond monetization at the Fed in New York. They're going to be free from those shackles and undercurrent. It's like blowing a fire hose under your house. Eventually, you lose a pillar and your house starts tilting. Well, that's what the Fed does for all these foreign central banks. China's going to be in charge of the international dollar. And the United States is going to have all these challenges, huge challenges to finance their own deficit, the government debt. And they're not going to have the Fed at the ready. What they're going to have to do is create their own dollar and devaluate it and encourage other nations to purchase some of their debt with, 30% decline in the dollar. Then another 30% months later. I'm thinking a total of 80% devaluation of the domestic dollar. We've covered this before. But, this whole Project Double Eagle by Russia is going to not just be a workaround the Swiss, it's going to be a kicking the SWIFT right in its ass and off the table.
It's going to be the new system.
It's going to be a new Eastern system. And look for China to give full weight behind it in support.
What about Saudi Arabia and President Obama made a special trip to fly down when he was overseas, made a special trip to Saudi Arabia. This is a country that last year said the Obama administration, quote, stabbed them in the back, end quote, over Syria. And now they're talking about, giving these man-pads, these shoulder-held missiles to equalize the power between, the Syrian Air Force and, dropping barrel bombs and whatever on the Al-Qaeda rebels. I mean, let's just call it what it is. They're upset, but don't they reach critical mass at some point when they see China and Russia and India? Don't they say, listen, we can't trade oil only in dollars. Sorry. Don't they say that at some point, Saudi Arabia?
I think the Saudis are going to make a business decision. Remember that 10 days ago or so, Prince Salman met in a very important Beijing conference with President Xi Jinping. President Xi, it's pronounced S-H-E-E, X-I is S-H-E-E, Xi. President Xi met with the Saudi economic representative and had all kinds of deals, projects, loan facilities, donations, charity, all kinds of things prepared. Okay, this is how the new protectorate role comes, with China flying around and floating around on the seas, sailing around with the big Chinese flag waving in the Persian Gulf and big guns on the deck. This is what the Saudis need, because after the Americans stabbed the Saudis in the back, the Americans and the British stole their gold in London. And when Obama got a 20-minute welcome and then suddenly the meeting was over, you can only speculate what on earth happened in Riyadh that pissed people off. And I'm thinking the Americans were told that Saudi will continue to work with China and bring about more quiet relations with Iran. You know, you don't become friendly with Iran without becoming an enemy of the United States. So Saudi is going to work closely with China and therefore closely with Iran and work toward the petro-yuan standard, where oil is purchased and sold in yuan terms. That's what's coming for the Saudis. And they're probably going to use some kind of a chicken liver approach by saying, you want to use euros, you want to use Swiss francs, you want to use pounds, you want to use yen, fine. Rubles, great. Yuan, fine. We welcome them all because we're a global player. We're a global supermarket for oil. But there's something else that the Saudis might have told Obama that angered him and his team. They might have said that we're not going to help you with your London gold shortage. And we don't like how you're stealing our gold. And they might have told Obama, we really don't like your stupid-ass Arab Spring and your support in the open of Al-Qaeda, because these are agencies and institutes and movements and grassroots elements that want to depose the Saudi monarch. So what are you doing? Now, what the United States has done is, in the last few years, in their desperation, they've basically thrown the Saudis under the bus. At the same time, the Saudis are big liars about their oil excess capacity. The excess capacity lies in Russia, in Canada. It does not lie in the Saudi Arabian peninsula. In fact, their big Ghawar oil field produces 90% water, 10% oil.
Let's bring this home and wrap this up back in the U.S. And I don't think we can say enough about this. I mean, do we have oil in the U.S.? Yes. Canada? Yes. Do we have some kind of a future in energy? And with Alaska? I'm sure we do. But people ask me that, well, aren't we going to just have our own oil and aren't we going to be able to compete with these people? I said, yeah, eventually, but it's not going to stop the collapse, the crash. And I know a lot of people have called me a drama queen for bringing up the collapse scenario, but I don't know how else you can take a look at all the information that people like you put out with the move away from the U.S. dollar, the split dollar, the massive devaluation that you're talking about, and not bring up the fact that there's going to be a collapse in standard of living, at the very least, here in the U.S. Can you talk about what it's going to look like here in the U.S. when this thing finally takes hold, which you're saying it's a matter of months away? If you look at the gold-backed yuan and the gold-backed ruble and all these deals working out, you say this is a pivotal year, 2014. What is it going to look like at the end of 2014, 2015 here in the U.S.?
Well, as these events take place, the United States is going to find itself where its Treasury bond is no longer of value, and the only way it's going to maintain its market value is by absolute and total corruption of the Treasury bond market and unbelievable reliance upon interest rate derivatives and excessive pressure on the Department of Treasury's Exchange Stabilization Fund. In other words, they're going to create a lot of paper, mythical, fictional, phantom demand. And that is going to cause the system to break. I think it's going to cause a derivative breakdown in the United States banking system, primarily with J.P. Morgan and Morgan Stanley. Those two, they're not really, they get Morgan in the name, but I don't know where Morgan Stanley got its name. So when foreign countries realize, well, gee, let's just say Poland, well, we don't need to store treasury bonds to buy oil. How about France? We don't need to store treasury bonds to buy oil from Saudis. They're going to start storing euros and rubles and yuan. So as they begin to realize that their treasury bonds are not going to be all that valuable anymore, and besides, their actual trading value is going to be supported by artificial, corrupted American market mechanisms, they're going to start dumping. They've already started dumping. In the 30 days ending in March 13th, foreign nations dumped $100 billion in treasury bonds. The United States tried to keep that quiet. In fact, if you look at a certain week, you can see, well, gee, they produced a rally. It's because they put on these interest rate derivatives again to create a phony demand and phony rally. So as the United States has all this colossal pressure on its treasury bond, it's going to be like everything that happened 3 years ago with the pigs nations, Portugal, Italy, Greece, Spain. They all had pressure that was to kill their sovereign bond. The U.S. is going to get the same thing, and their reaction is going to be, all right, we've had enough, we're going to make our own dollar. The United States is going to have its own domestic dollar, call it the Republic dollar, call it whatever you want. I call it the shit dollar or the shice dollar, whatever. But they're going to talk about how it's going to be oil and gold backed. And it's going to be a bunch of bullcrap because their gold is the deep storage gold unmined in mountains like held in Colorado and Nevada. I mean, that's not gold bullion, that's gold hope. Now, they're going to be backing the new dollar on BS.
But what does that look like what does that look like to the street level? What kind of inflation are people going to see? What kind of disruption is that going to be on the street level here in America?
When the Treasury bond is under pressure and they have to come up with a new dollar, what they have to do is finance the U.S. government debt. And in order to do that, they need to cheapen the dollar. They need foreign suppliers to be willing to take dollars. Well, they don't want the dollar at the current level. It's got to be a cheaper dollar. So the huge challenge, Greg, is going to be, do we make it a 50% dollar devaluation for this new shice dollar? I don't like calling it a republic dollar because the United States is not a republic. It's a fascist dictatorship. If they do a 50% devaluation of this shice dollar, what you're going to see is a 100% inflation on imported products. But they're not going to do a 50% devaluation. They're going to do something like a 25, 30, or 35, a gradual kind of thing that will not produce equilibrium, and that is the key. Because they want to do it gradually, the 25 or 30% devaluation will have to have another one in 4 to 6 months of equal volume, equal size. So, in 6 or 8 months, they're likely to have a 60% or so devaluation, or maybe a 70% devaluation, and that's going to cause over a 100% increase on anything imported. I'm not talking about Iowa corn. I'm not talking about razor blades made in, a South Carolina plant. I'm talking about imported objects like a computer made in Japan or the Pacific Rim. I'm talking about like a disk drive component that you want to replace on a fried computer. And, all right, I need a new disk drive. I'm talking about a Toyota car. I'm talking about a Hyundai car from Korea. I'm talking about, a German construction equipment piece of machinery. I'm talking about all these imported devices, imported products, finished products, crude products. It could be lumber from Brazil. It could be, copper from Chile or Bolivia. It's going to cost twice as much.
We're going to see basically in months 100% 100% inflation roughly. That's what you're saying. on average.
Imported products.
Yes, that'll trickle down to everything else. I mean, people will go crazy.
Whatever the dollar devaluates, it's not exactly like. I'll give you an example. A 30% dollar devaluation results in a 42% increase in the price of foreign imports. You got to. I mean, the reason it's that is because 7/10 on a 30% devaluation is 10/7. Well, 10/7 is 1 3/7, which is 1.42. So a 42% increase on a 30% dollar devaluation. Just for some simple math, a 50% dollar devaluation brings about a doubling in the import prices. But the United States imports only half of what it needs. So whatever you get for this foreign import price inflation, divide it by 2. I think we're going to get an 80% dollar devaluation in about 5 steps, which will cause, just do the math again. 80% is 1 over 5 for a devaluation. So what's 5 over 1? That's 500. So that's your 1 plus 4 more. 400% import price inflation is what I'm expecting. I don't know when. I'm just saying that, don't trap me and say, Jim Willie is calling for a 400% price inflation. I'm saying that eventually, to meet equilibrium, the new Scheist dollar, the Republic dollar that comes about, will have to be devaluated by 80%, which is going to result in a tremendous increase in imported prices. And there's a good side to this, believe it or not. It means that the United States is going to be able to sell machine tools because it's going to be cheaper. They're going to be competing against Germans and Japanese that are much more expensive. So it's going to be a reindustrialization of the United States after all the chaos. And if you're wondering what's the chaos going to look like, take a look at Venezuela. They only had a 73% devaluation of their currency, and guess what? They don't have beans in the store. Beans are a staple. We don't have. The United States doesn't have an equivalent, maybe corn. But in Venezuela, they take their beans and they sell it to foreigners to get foreign currency. That's what's coming in the United States. U.S. output is going to be sold to foreigners. And then the local American citizens are going to wonder, how come the supermarket shelves are empty? Why are all the U.S. agri-corps selling to foreign countries? It's because they want to bring in currency, just like Venezuela. This is third world, guys. That's what the new Scheist dollar is going to introduce to the United States. All this backfire from abuse by the Federal Reserve. The QE1, QE2, Operation Twist, QE3, taper talk that failed. It's pretty clear. It's QE to infinity. And Janet Yellen is a freaking liar. They're doubling and tripling their volume.
What's going to happen to gold? Is Wall Street going to take this suppression game and flip it on its back and send it to the moon, to gold and silver prices? Is that coming?
Well, Wall Street's not going to be in charge. It's going to be the owners of gold. Wall Street is the seller of gold. Wall Street is the rapist, violator of gold.
So are the holders of gold, the foreigners, going to take this thing and say, we're going to send this up?
They're going to move it to $5,000 and $7,000 an ounce. They're going to move the silver price to $200 and $300 and $400 an ounce. Because all the world's central banks are going to need gold. They're all going to be selling their treasury bonds to buy gold to make for a solution to their banking systems. Now, what's the missing solution for all these stinking 5 years since Lehman? 5.5 years. What's the missing piece?
Solvency.
It's solvency and it's legitimate reserves.
Yes.
Hard asset gold reserve. So the whole world is going to join this gold standard led by China and Russia. Germany will join, and when they join, it's game over for the United States and the West, because Germany already, I heard this is yesterday from The Voice. He said, I made a point that the German bankers are very pro-U.S. and pro-London. New York and London. They play ball, and they brought in Bankers Trust into Deutsche Bank, and all the derivatives have been managed by Deutsche Bank. Well, that's broken now. Deutsche Bank's going to be moved into 5 or 7 different companies. This is going to be just horrible for London and New York. But the point I made was that the bankers are very loyal to New York and London, but the industrialists in Germany are very much eager to play ball with Russia and China. And the Voice wrote back and said, I got news for you. 90% of industrial, pardon me, I need a little water. 90% of German industrial executives in their corporations are pro-Russia. 90%. Yeah, they don't need to be convinced to play ball with Russia.
6,000, just in Germany, 6,000. I couldn't believe this number. 6,000 German companies are doing business. 6,000 German companies are doing business in Russia right now. And so when I saw that, it was a Reuters story, and I saw that, I thought, sanctions, didn't anybody in the Obama administration go, hey, you guys going to help us with these sanctions? And they would have gotten no from everybody in the EU. And you're saying that when this thing happens, gold and silver will ricochet up, and anybody holding it is going to have an immediate, the opposite, the antithesis of what's going to happen to dollar holders. It's going to ricochet up. What happens to the banks in the U.S.? Could they have a banking holiday? Are they going to keep people from saying, "Whoa, I better start spending my money now. I better get into my bank"? Are they going to shut the banks down and have capital controls like Cyprus and that kind of thing?
Oh, absolutely. I don't know how many banks in the United States will survive. They're going to have to recapitalize. Again, the problem for the last 5.5 years since Lehman is that these big banks do not have legitimate reserve core. Well, they're going to start acquiring it, using their treasury bonds to buy gold. They're going to use their euro bonds to buy gold. They're going to be using their British gilt bonds to buy gold. They're going to be using their Japanese government bonds to buy gold.
When is this going to happen? When is the big ricochet
I don't
up?
know, but we're starting to see, when you talk about Project Double Eagle and the fully convertible Chinese yuan, that's not 2 years away, but it's 2 months away in the Shanghai Free Trade Zone. It's already been announced, not in the U.S. press. Don't want to announce that there's going to be a fully convertible yuan. No, we're going to start to see soon some very important but interesting rumbles, like the Persian Gulf nations. They got what they call a Gulf co-op. Gulf co-op. It's a group of about 6 nations. It's not all the nations, but it's Saudi Arabia and Bahrain and Kuwait and a few others. I think they're going to come up with a gold-backed Gulf dinar. If the Russians come up with one and the Chinese come out with one, a currency, gold-backed, then the countries that don't come out with one are going to slip into the third world. So the Gulf nations of the Persian Gulf, the Saudis, I think they come up with a Gulf dinar. And I think Germany, Austria, Finland, and Netherlands, that 4, will come up with a gold-backed Nordic euro. It gets better. Latin American countries are already unifying to make what they call a regional currency. If you talk about a regional currency, you raise the anger of the U.S. government. You start getting attacks. You start getting earthquakes. You start getting banks that don't have any money in them anymore from hacking. So they call it a regional currency. Well, I got a source that tells me that Panama has got a huge amount of gold that on a per capita basis is 4 times as much as Fort Knox had. And furthermore, Panama has something like 30 billion pounds of copper. So Panama is going to have a gold and copper-backed currency. It gets better. I think we're going to start hearing even Norway will have a gold-backed krone. So this is all coming, and it's going to be a parade. Hey, let's make our own. Then you're going to start seeing the African nations. Now, what's the hint behind an asset-backed currency. It doesn't have to be gold. I think that the Norwegian krone is going to be oil-backed. But they can quickly convert oil to gold because oil is black gold. These African countries that are gigantic, the Congo is as big as all of Western Europe. The Congo and several other countries in Africa, you're going to get like a regional South African asset-backed currency. You're going to get Nigeria and its neighbors joining together, whose nations together are larger than Western Europe. Just add them all up together, join them together. They're loaded with resources. They can make their own asset-backed currency. They don't need the dollar.
And all this, you think, is
the plethora, the litany of signals that the financial system is imploding. I mean, we're getting the U.S. dollar in a sell-off. We're having U.S. Treasury bonds rapidly losing their integrity. You're having the U.S. government leadership from the banking sector and military sector losing their global leadership. You're having threats to the interest rate swap derivatives that support the Treasury bonds. You're having rumblings among the Saudis that indicate to me that the petrodollar is about to break down. What you're really seeing is a host of reasons, a host of factors that are pointing to the U.S. dollar imminently to lose its global reserve status for currencies and trading and banking, along with its integrity. The world is saying your dollar is our problem. That's the big issue. I honestly believe, Greg, that the systemic death, demise, kaput, occurred in September of 2008. The
financial meltdown.
Yeah, the financial meltdown, and they called it a global currency crisis. Well, why did the crisis last for 5 years? It's not a crisis. It's a death event. The U.S. dollar and its trading vehicle, a Treasury bond and Treasury bill, they're dead. And we have extraordinary tactics and processes in place to keep the system going because they don't want all the big U.S. and Western banks to die, and the Wall Street bankers don't want to lose their privilege to print money for themselves. So the military defense for the U.S. dollar is slowly being revealed vividly, and it's slipping away. I look at a very key factor being the Saudis right now.
I wanted you to bring that up because some people that I have talked to have kind of sloughed that off. Like, well, they're just puffing or they're just not being really serious, and who's going to protect them? And lo and behold, you read in the reported press, I think The Guardian or one of the foreign big papers, saying that they have an order in for nuclear weapons to Pakistan. Some people say they may have already have those weapons. But so it seems to me, and I'm just a guy who looks at the news and tries to figure out what's going on just by the overt press, that they're going to protect themselves. What say you?
Well, I look at the press reports, and I use my general 80-20 rule. 80% of what you read about in the press is a lie. So the flip side is true on the internet. 80% of what you read is true. So you got 20% sensational on the internet, and you got only 20% truth in the mainstream press. All right, so what's the mainstream press saying when they talk about the Saudis? Well, they want to neutralize or offset the Iranian threat. I think it's a bunch of hogwash and bull cookies. I think it's more like the Saudis are feeling more alone than they have in 70 years. The Saudis have run up against the Russians in Syria and backed down with the United States and have huge resentment formally stated against the United States officials. They're feeling alone. And my summary line is they're feeling betrayed by the Americans. They run up against the Russian wall, and they're going to fall into the Chinese hands.
Oh, what a great vivid picture of what's going to run up against the Russian wall and fall into the Chinese hands. They're making a big refinery there, aren't they? That's going to be online next year. The Chinese are building and basically funding a big refinery in Saudi Arabia.
Yes, it's on the Red Sea, and I think it was begun a year ago. And just think of it as infusing a lot of Chinese yuan currency into Saudi Arabia's economy. It's not going to be long before you hear that the Saudis will accept Chinese yuan from any party for crude oil.
And when that happens, what happens to the dollar?
Well, I think at that point you're going to see a mass of diversification by every Tom, Dick, and Harry nation in the world to sell off their treasury bonds, to get rid of them. They're not going to need them so much anymore. They're going to start collecting Chinese yuan. They're going to start announcing that they want to try to compete as a yuan-based bond center, bond sale for investment banking. Look at what's going on in London. They not only have a Chinese yuan swap facility, they're announcing that they're going to be a broker agent for selling Chinese yuan-based debt. And there are a number of companies like McDonald's. McDonald's sells corporate bonds in Chinese yuan. I mean, this is not breaking new ground. But when the Saudis announce that yuan and maybe even, British pounds, Swiss francs, Chinese yuan, obviously, but Japanese yen, they're all accepted.
And euro.
And euros. They're already accepting some euros. That's not new. It's a small percentage. If I had to guess, I'd say it's 10 to 20% of
that's a pretty big percentage of.
It is pretty big, but it's not enough to dent something like 70% of global trade that's in dollars. And when you get the change by the OPEC leader in oil sales, you're going to get a lot of nations following. To start with, Nigeria and all the other OPEC nations, the Persian Gulf nations. Is Kuwait going to say the same thing? Is Oman? Is Bahrain? Is UAE? All these oil-producing nations, are they going to say the same thing? My guess is hell yes. And then you get the reaction by the banking reserves management in the Western world. We don't need to hold on to so many treasury bonds anymore. The Americans who observe the Saudi problem don't make the link between accepting non-dollars for oil and diversifying away from treasury bonds in their banking system.
Isn't that just smart? I mean, I'm listening to you and and others and saying, hey, we have a bond bubble. Hey, this is a problem. Other people and you have said we're exporting inflation. The rest of the world is upset about exporting inflation. Their food prices are skyrocketing, and it's causing, destabilization all over the globe. And it would just be smart. It's not even anti-American. It would just be a smart business move, wouldn't it, to diversify and then once again take yuan or ruble, or because they don't take ruble, but yen, euro, real, to take anybody's currency in trade. I mean, isn't that what they're working for with this gold backed bank that you're talking about?
Well, the problem, Greg, is it sounds like an obvious plan, but there's a shortcoming to doing so, and that is there's not enough liquidity in the Chinese yuan, and there's way less in the Russian ruble. So what we need is, like all the BRICS nations, to say, temporarily, we're going to settle trade in yuan. That would be a big lift for the liquidity of the Chinese yuan floating around. There's a benefit from being a bankrupt nation like the U.S. You got a lot of treasury bonds in liquidity. I mean, it's ironically pathetic. The Chinese have big debt, to be sure, but a lot of it is contained as regional debt. Their regional banks and regional development has debt with the central government and central bank. It's not floated for a wealthy Taiwanese investor or Russian investor or French investor. It's all kept inside China. That's slowly changing. Slowly changing. We're going to get some major resets. Let me answer the second half of your question.
That's right, the global currency reset. And then you told me in the pre-interview in our notes that it's going to have 6 to 8 sides. Can you explain what the global currency reset will look like with a 6 to 8 sided event?
This is enormously complicated, and that's why it's taking so long. If I could identify what the 4th, 5th, and 6th elements were, I'd be a genius and I'd be an insider. I can't.
Well, then at least tell us what the global reset will look like. The global currency reset.
Okay, let me tell you what I do know. I'm pretty clear on what I don't know, and it's hard to communicate that. But we're on the verge of an urgent reestablishment of a new financial structure. It's called the Global Currency Reset, and I find it funny. You see things like the acronym GCR. I mean, I gotta laugh. GCR is Global Currency Reset, which means it's becoming a mainstream concept, like the global financial crisis, GFC. I wondered a year ago, what the hell is GFC? Okay, well then I figured it out from context. The big Western banks have to be restored to solvency quickly because they need a radical plan now. We're on the verge, time is running out for a collapse. And the collapse would involve the banks. The collapse would involve sovereign banks. The collapse would involve a couple of major currencies. So the banks, bonds, and currencies are all on the edge of collapse. And they must do something because there's a very interesting factor that entered into the equation after Lehman Brothers went down. And that's what I call lashing. It's a ship term. Long ago when there were storms at sea, someone had to go up, or a team had to go up and unfurl the sails because they're getting whipped around. And what they did was they tied each other together around the waist with rope, and then they tied that rope to a main mast. So if a guy slipped off something and fell on the deck and then went overboard, they could pull him in. Well, now you have all the major Western banks lashed together by derivatives. Notice no big major Western bank has gone down. When the first one goes down, 10 will go down in the next 2 weeks. I thought that Deutsche Bank or Barclays or Citigroup were going to go down. Citibank were going to go down. One of the three. They didn't. But Deutsche Bank is on the edge, probably in the worst condition, because they've been revealed for their derivative fraud and all kinds of accounting fraud related to it in the sale of contracts that keep the system going. All right, so what would the reset involve? The banks, the bonds, and the currencies. But a new side that I wasn't aware of was made clear to me last weekend, a week ago, 8 days ago, 9 days ago, 10 days ago. Anyway, it's a military side. It seems to me that the global currency reset is not just going to involve the financials that will have a direct effect on the economies, which are in a deadly death spiral of extreme recession, if not depression. I don't buy for a minute the 2% growth in the U.S. GDP. That's a bunch of hogwash and bull cookies. The fourth element that seems to be involved in the reset is the military and the nuclear threat. I'm hearing that the U.S. is in negotiations at the same time for the currency reset to make agreements on who would not bomb whom. And that's very big. And I think
the U.S. not bombing Iran.
Well, Iran's the joke that we talk about in the press. there's no Iran nuclear weapon development. It's the BS story when what Iran has been doing is selling energy, oil and gas, outside the dollar. Therefore, we don't like that. We declare them a rogue nation and tell everybody that they're a nuclear threat, impose sanctions, swift obstructions for their banks, and put on blacklist any nations that do business with them. Why? Because Iran's selling oil and gas outside the dollar, just like Saddam Hussein. Americans need to wake the hell up. Iran is not a major threat except to the dollar.
So what countries are on the chopping block that are trying to that would nuke or would get nuked? I mean, who's up for being nuked? Is the United States a possible nuclear target by Russia or China, or what are we talking about here?
The United States is a target by itself. The Russians and Chinese aren't going to launch anything against the United States. It's more likely to be a rogue U.S. entity. False flag. Blamed on Iran or Russia or China or whoever the hell. Whatever the morons will lap up in the U.S. press. No, the problem is that the U.S. is at the point of desperation, along with England, that they're ready to attack anybody who gets in the way of the continuation of the dollar. Remember back in the spring of 2011, Norway was attacked. That was an attack by the British secrets, what do you call it? MI6.
With the guy with the rifle, taking target practice.
The lone gunman. The 85th lone gunman. How many lone gunmen do we need to see before we conclude that they are not lone gunmen?
Yeah.
I get tired of the moron line because I'm not a moron.
But why
I gave up being a moron a long time ago. What's that?
Why did they attack Norway? Why was Norway targeted?
Because they have an $800 billion pension fund based on North Sea oil, and they refuse to make it available to the London bankers who are in trouble.
Ah. Well, tell me, so how fast could the breakdown happen? And what does it look like to the man on the street?
I don't know the timetable, but I got some messages in the last several days saying that very important negotiations are going on, and it seems like France, Japan, and Saudi Arabia are the obstacles now, whereas for the past previous months it was the United States. So anyone who objects or provides an obstacle to the global currency reset, I regard as being in the line of fire for a string of bank failures. So
France has some pretty big banks that are very weak.
Exactly. So they don't want the reset because it means their banks are going to fail. Japan doesn't want the reset because it means their banks and their bonds are going to fail. I left out the French bonds. And the Saudis don't want the reset because it means they lose their boyfriend, the U.S. military. I mean, these are really sick relationships that are being sustained, and they can't continue.
But the reset,
firmly,
I don't interrupt you, but the reset is going to come anyway.
It's going to come with the U.S. kicking and screaming along with its main allies.
And that means that the reset will be, well, we're not going to have another world reserve currency, the yuan, to go with the dollar and to compete with the dollar. And eventually, I guess, overtake it.
Something like that. It's going to be very hard to say, well, there's no more dollar usage. It's going to be more like a handoff. And, next year it'll be 20% less, the dollar being used. The following year it'll be 30% less, something like that. Or, in 6 months it'll be 20% less. And the following 6 months, another 10 or 15% less. It's going to be a transition. But I firmly believe that we're going to see something happen with the Chinese yuan soon. And I don't define timeline to clients or friends or colleagues. I think we're going to see something change with the Chinese yuan, whereby it is going to be recognized as equivalent with a gold-backed letter of credit, a gold-backed trade note, we're going to see some gold trade notes acting as letters of credit to grease trade, to provide lubrication and facilitation for trade. I believe the Chinese yuan is going to be something of an intermediary toward gold trade settlement. And I don't have all the details, but I do know, I've known this for 18 months. Gold trade note will be the letter of credit. And if you want to have trade between two nations, you better get your gold trade note letter of credit ready. And if you don't have sufficient gold, you can hire Turkey as an intermediary. You can hire perhaps India as a functional intermediary with Turkey. But Turkey has done this for 1,000 years. It's what Turkey does.
When this reset happens, what happens to gold and the dollar?
Well, I think we're going to see as part of this reset. Let me just back up a second. I will answer the question. Let me lead up to it because it's very interesting how it comes out. I got messages repeatedly from The Voice, and he's a very prominent gold trader in the world. And he's got some very incredible clients, very wealthy clients in central banks, and some of them are in the Eastern Hemisphere. He wrote me and said, we're getting incredible pressure as part of the reset to execute a 50% dollar devaluation. And I wrote back and said, well, if we got a set of floating currencies, does that mean the euro is going to go to 250 or 270? And he said, no, the euro is going to get heavily damaged too. It will probably suffer the same fate as the dollar. And I said, well, let me continue on this line of thought. The logic would then dictate that if the floating currencies are maintained, that's the big premise, then the British pounds, Swiss franc, and the Japanese yen would all go up 100%. And he said, not quite. It doesn't work that way. All right, well then what is going on? If the dollar is in a 50% devaluation, then we're going to see the gold price double overnight.
Wow.
That's how we bring about instant solvency for the banks. So, are the banks out there rushing to accumulate gold? I kind of doubt it on the U.S. and London side. So, therefore, the foreign nations are all for the currency reset, whereas the U.S. and London and maybe the little harlot Paris, France, they're against it. France is a unique nation. They're a little frickin' harlot. I can't stand their government, their banking industry, and their cooperation with security agencies for the longest time. They're these pretenders to international leadership, the French being supposedly the diplomatic official language. Give me a break. I find my French, I got a junior year award in high school. I was the best out of 150 in my high school in French. Hasn't been worth a dime to me in this adult world. Now, Spanish is how you get ahead. It's also how you land the ladies. But the global currency reset is a hidden adjustment. It's like a grand project to restore in some form a quasi-gold standard. And it's going to result in a giant leap up, a quantum nonlinear leap up in the gold price in dollar terms, which you could interpret on the flip side as being a dollar devaluation in terms of the stable currency, the ultimate currency, gold bullion.
Does this happen this year or 14?
I don't know. Time is very difficult. I don't know how much more the U.S., French, Japanese, and Saudis are going to get in the way. Do you?
I do not.
So I don't know. I think that these nations are going to come kicking and screaming, and what's going to motivate them is that their banks are going to collapse anyway.
So you're saying that the U.S. banks could collapse, and a currency devaluation would keep them from collapsing, a dollar devaluation overnight.
I don't know that anything is going to prevent them from collapsing because I don't know that they've accumulated much gold. All right, let's just focus on China, for instance. This is a very interesting case. The Voice said to me a message about 3 weeks ago. It was very intriguing. He said, incredibly, the Chinese have already made preparations for writing off, letting go, not redeeming, not even salvaging, just writing off $1 trillion in U.S. Treasury bond debt. And I wrote back and said, are they expecting to regain that loss in an offset with the reset on gold? And he implied that that's the correct line of thinking. And then I went to how many tons do the Chinese have, and if we double in the price or we go to 2,500, will that offset the trillion? And it looks like we need to go to about $3,000 in the gold price in order for the Chinese to offset that $1 trillion loss. Maybe they've got a little more gold bullion than I thought. It's been indicated to me that the Chinese have on the order of 10 to 15 times as much gold as their last official admission from a formal statement. I'm told that they've got on the order of 10 to 15,000 tons of gold. And, I don't want to get into some of my other information because it's kind of confidential, and I like to leave some of it for the subscribers.
Got it.
The drainage that happened in April, May, June, July in 2012, the drainage of London gold for improper use in margin on derivatives, like just think of, say, sovereign bond futures contracts or Forex swaps that integrate those French, Italian, Spanish, and Portuguese bonds with the euro. There were some improper usage of Chinese gold. I don't want to get into a lot of the details, but I was told a specific number of 5,000 tons in those 4 months in 2012. 5,000 tons went from London to points east. I usually assume it's, Beijing or Hong Kong, but it's not 100% true. Just think of it being 90% true. Well, I've been told that exodus of gold has not stopped. I asked a question to key people back in September, October, November, December. Has the drainage of London gold continued? And I got zero answer. Now I'm being told, suddenly, in the context of reset, that drainage of London gold has continued. So maybe they've moved as much as 10 or 12,000 tons from London and Switzerland in the last year and a half. That's incredible. That sets up the currency reset. It sets up the paradigm shift. I don't find much of any analysts in the gold community discussing the paradigm shift, which is part and parcel of the reset.
Speaking of reset, is the United States, the dollar, are they going to willingly cut the value of the dollar in half when they realize we're not going to be the lone reserve currency, that China is going to be our competitor, and we're redeeming all these bonds, and we don't want to redeem these bonds? Could they just cut the dollar in half and say, well, we'll pay you 50 cents on the dollar for your bonds, which is a technical default, isn't it?
Well, I have to ask, 50% cut relative to what? It's the same issue I brought up with the Voice. Are you going to see the euro going up to 270 on a double? Okay, now, it could be that the dollar devaluation will be integrated with a Treasury bond default and, restructuring of the debt itself. So maybe the debt will be restructured. I don't have the answers to this, but I think what you propose is possibly going to happen as part of the reset. I think what we're going to see is the dollar admitting we're no longer the global currency reserve, and then the vacuum gets filled by a combination of gold and the yuan, while the dollar gets slowly phased out in its role as the currency reserve. When I say reserve, I'm talking about bank reserves like in Belgium, bank reserves in Germany. They're not going to be Treasury bonds so much anymore, which begs the question, what's Russia going to do with their $200 billion worth? They're going to convert them to gold. The Treasury bond is going to be phased out as the standard and gold will be phased in. It's complicated. It will not happen quickly. It's going to have phases.
And what happens here to the man on the street when we have this 50% decline in the value of the dollar? Do people wake up one day and go, oh my gosh, my Starbucks latte is $8.50, not $4?
Well, again, Greg, I got to repeat it. It's the same issue. The dollar may not change value versus the other currencies. It's going to be gold. So
gold will skyrocket.
Your Starbucks doesn't have a gold ingredient in the recipe. Now,
so anybody holding gold, and what happens to silver? Anybody holding gold is going to have a 50% gain overnight. What about silver?
I think we're going to start a sequence of events. Again, it's an event-driven scenario. When the reset begins, you're then going to get new pressure in stage 2, as I call it, for the dollar to split. Because you got too many foreign-held dollars. I like to say in Switzerland, Panama, Singapore, and Hong Kong. The U.S. does not have jurisdiction over those banks. Therefore, those dollars will remain as dollars, and all those foreign contracts will remain sovereign and intact. The U.S. must create, in phase 2, a split dollar, a domestic dollar. I heard the name Republic dollar, and that's what's going to get devaluated and affect the price of your Starbucks coffee.
Well, so much out there. I know you wanted to bring up the Goldman Sachs and the real reason why AIG was rescued, and that is because AIG was rescued and thus Goldman Sachs was rescued. Is that it? Is Goldman Sachs out of the woods?
No, they're facing imminent death. Goldman Sachs is facing imminent death, and believe me, I have not had this story on my desk for long. I'll tell you what happened. I've got a contact who works in London, and he's a subscriber. And he's supplied me with some pretty interesting information because he worked in Wall Street before he worked in London. And he's not a British subject, and he's not an American citizen. He just has a lot of information, and he kept his contacts in Wall Street after he moved to London. He said, Jim, you may not find this all that credible, but hear me out. The TARP fund was set up as a hidden rescue of Goldman Sachs. Recall that Goldman Sachs enjoyed full redemption, 100% redemption of the different credit default swaps. We're not talking about interest rate derivatives. We're talking about credit default swaps against failed bonds.
Their insurance.
Yeah, and they were underwritten by AIG. So AIG was about to go bust, and suddenly the U.S. government stepped in with the major hand involved being Hank Paulson, ex-CEO of Goldman Sachs. So the U.S. government, which was run on its finance arm by Goldman Sachs, decided to rescue AIG, which would therefore make it simple to rescue Goldman Sachs. Because Goldman Sachs had a nearly equal exposure that Lehman Brothers did to the mortgage bond situation.
Sophie's choice.
Yeah. So then Goldman Sachs refused to adopt Lehman Brothers and instead decided to kill Lehman Brothers with the help of J.P. Morgan. They didn't provide them the cash in an overnight transaction, a series of them, and suddenly Lehman Brothers found themselves illiquid. Why? Because Goldman Sachs and J.P. Morgan didn't pay their bill. So Goldman Sachs forced the great bust in 2008, and since then, Goldman Sachs has been jockeying to stay alive. Notice that they reapplied for their Goldman Sachs Incorporated. I don't have their formal name. I think it's Goldman Sachs Group. I can't think. But they became a commercial bank.
Oh, right.
What?
The FDIC insurance.
Well, more than that. They wanted to be in a position to acquire, say, Bank of America, or to acquire, say, Wells Fargo, or to acquire Citibank in order to stay alive. these big banks, in order to stay alive, they need the bail-in to steal depositors' money, to confiscate money. Goldman Sachs is the only Wall Street bank that is not in a position to benefit from a bail-in.
That's right. They don't have depositors. And you think
they don't have any big bank? I mean, take a look at Citigroup. Take a look at J.P. Morgan. Take a look at Bank of America. They've got 2 million clients.
And you think the bail-in for these other banks are coming?
Well, I don't know. I thought so last spring and summer, and in recent months, I think it's more like the bail-in is an insurance policy that makes sure that the too big to fail banks are never forced into liquidation. You want to force us into liquidation? We'll steal 10 million people's private accounts. So there's not going to be any big bank failure. They won't fail because the nation does not want to see 10 million or 20 million or more private accounts confiscated or just given a haircut of 30% or whatever. Goldman Sachs is still struggling to stay alive. Notice that the financial regulatory stipulations were just reversed a week ago. The FinReg, the Dodd-Frank bill, whatever you want to call it. I like to call it.
the House.
Yeah, the FinReg or the Dodd-Frank, those two names, same thing. They changed the law. They put in, what's the word? They delayed imposition of the law whereby these banks would have to set aside collateral against their derivatives. So remember back in April of 2009, the Financial Accounting Standards Board said these big banks can declare whatever value they want for their portfolio.
Still going on. Phony accounting.
FinReg and Dodd-Frank, that law, the financial regulation law, pardon me, was going to say no more. Well, last week, they were told, go ahead, continue to do so. You don't need to post collateral for your wrecked derivatives. And my theory, and I said this in the September newsletter for the Hetrick letter, the big move in the Treasury bonds from 1.65% to 2.95% between May and September killed the big banks because it gave them huge, outsized derivative losses. And the Dodd-Frank bill was going to force them to come up with collateral in order to fill that gap for their banking structure. So the white horses came in. Goldman Sachs ordered, no, not now. And now they changed the FinReg law, and they've delayed its imposition. And I'm sure some of its authors are really pissed off in the Congress. But don't worry, Goldman Sachs will bribe them.
But you think that they're going to be out of business in the next few years?
I don't know. I don't put a time. Everybody else tries to put a time on it. I don't.
But you think they're in trouble. Of all the big banks, they're in trouble.
They're in line for this series of dominoes of ugly events. They're in line to be damaged and wrecked. So, here's another reality check for these big banks. They were given leeway not to put collateral forth for their derivative losses. Does that mean they're more liquid? No, that's just accounting.
Right.
They're still in trouble. They're just not going to admit it, and they're not going to fold and say we're dead. They're going to continue as bigger, more empty, more blackened zombies. Uglier, bigger zombies.
And
that's what's coming.
And
they're not going to be protected from failure.
And the U.S. government, i.e. the dollar, continues to be printed to bail them out.
I believe that the Fed is not doing $40 billion a month in its QE. I think it's more like $200 to $400 billion a month for QE, because if you include all the derivatives, interest rate derivatives supporting the system, it's 5 times bigger than admit.
That just cannot go on. In other words, $40 billion for mortgage-backed securities, that's what the banks get, and 45 for the Treasury bonds. That's $85 billion. But you're saying the entire ball of wax is, $300 or $400 billion. Other people say it's much higher too.
Well, yeah, I think they're on track to following what's happened with the interest rate derivatives. You cannot have a move from 1.65 to 2.95 in 4 months on the 10-year Treasury without colossal leverage damage. We're talking leverage of 50 to 1, 70 to 1. I've heard as much as 100 to 1 leverage on these interest rate derivatives. Well, Morgan Stanley, I think, stands in the line of fire because they're the chief cook and bottle washer in the interest rate derivative office. So, we got some big events happening. I think we're going to continue to see acceleration of events. I don't know when this thing is going to fall apart. I don't know when the global currency reset is going to happen. I think something's going to happen, though, pretty soon. And again, I don't put a time on it. People send me emails, well, when do you think soon is? I say, I don't know. When do you think it is?
But it is going to fall apart at some point.
It's going to fall apart, and it's probably going to happen something like this. A big Western bank is teetering, and suddenly a mid-sized intermediary bank, for instance, Commerce Bank. Commerce Bank is not a gigantic bank in Germany. It's a good-sized, it's not a small fry. It's a good-sized intermediate bank. Well, they might renege on a corresponding payment overnight with a major bank and start a ripple effect. So a medium-sized bank might cause a problem for a giant bank with their intermediary corresponding role. For instance, if you want to do a bank wire, a transfer from, say, Rio de Janeiro to Nicaragua, just Nicaragua, for example. Well, it's not going to go through New York. Okay? Nicaragua. It's not going to go through New York. It'll find a different intermediary, a major bank intermediary. So Rio de Janeiro to Nicaragua by way of Commerce Bank, perhaps. I don't know. I don't have all the answers, but there are lots of intermediary banks providing corresponding bank functions in the facilities. Something's going to go wrong. These guys have too many holes in the dike. They're running out of fingers. I don't make the analogy that they've only got 10 fingers. No, I think they've got 80 fingers. They always bring in some new fingers, new hands. It's new harlots, like the French.
Jim Willie, you are the editor of the Hat Trick Letter. It can be found on goldenjackass.com. Again, editor of the Hat Trick Letter. That's your paid subscription base. That you can find it on goldenjackass.com. Really appreciate you coming on today and giving us a big giant snapshot of what's going on in the global financial system. Thank you, sir, very much.
And let me, as a final note, if you permit me just 10 seconds.
Sure.
Miss Universe just completed its pageant, and all 5 top finalists were Latinas. Venezuela, Philippines, Spain, Brazil, Ecuador. The Venezuelan doll won it. Latinas